family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Tradition 6 in our second legacy of unity. And I am really honored to have my special guest with me today, Greg G. Greg, do me a favor and please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Hey, thanks, Rick. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Greg. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is July the 21st of 2008. My home group is the BYOC, that's Bring Your Own Coffee group. We meet every day at 6 p.m. Central on Zoom. And I came into Alcoholics Anonymous at the tender age of 23 and a half years old because drinking had really kicked my butt.
Totally understand. Also, do me a favor. I don't think you mentioned this. What part of the United States are you from? Where are you located?
So I live in Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City, Missouri. Wonderful.
Yep.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for being with us. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. When we're doing an episode on the traditions, I always like to read from the foreword of the 12 and 12 to kind of lay out a foundation of what the traditions are so that everyone fully understands. And it says this: AA's traditions apply to the life of the fellowship itself. They outline the means by which AA maintains its unity and relates itself to the world about it, the way it lives and the way it grows. And one of the reasons that I love that statement is because it very specifically says that the spiritual principles that are in each of our traditions were built for the fellowship, right? And for our groups to remain healthy, but they also apply to us. And I love being able to look at, and we'll probably jump into this, I love being able to look at how the spiritual principles of this tradition can be applied in our personal lives. I also want to read both the long and the short form of this tradition. So we're talking about Tradition 6 today, and the short form is this: an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. The long form of Tradition 6 is considerably longer, and it says this: problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An AA group, as such, should never go into business. Secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals, which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart that, if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the AA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of those people who financially support them. For clubs, AA managers are usually preferred. But hospitals, as well as other places of recuperation, ought to be well outside AA and medically supervised. While an AA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never to go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An AA group can bind itself to no one. And I like to have and to talk about the spiritual principle underlying the step, the tradition, or the concept. And in this case, I like to use the spiritual principle of non-affiliation. You know, we and kind of the overarching idea of Tradition 6 is we keep it in house, right? We keep it in house, but we never forget, never forget Tradition 5, that our primary purpose is to carry the message to the still suffering alcoholics. So when I asked you to be a guest on this podcast and gave you the choice of what you wanted to speak on, you chose Tradition 6. Tell me why you chose to speak on this tradition.
Well, it's funny because I wanted to talk about the problems of money, property, and prestige part, because the no endorsement thing is pretty straightforward. The example in the 12 and 12 is a great one. You know, the idea of, you know, if we didn't have this tradition, we would end up with the official beer of AA, right?
Right, exactly. You can count on that.
Yeah, I mean, like that's what I mean. The example in the 12 and 12 is that the big distilleries were getting together. They wanted to get into the alcohol education business, and they wanted somebody from AA who had some marketing and public relations background to come out there and to be their man. And then of course this was gonna, and it's so, I mean, it's so ridiculous on its face, but absolutely that's what would happen, you know. And that's a big part of why Alcoholics Anonymous can't get involved in those sort of things. And I love what you said about the idea of unaffiliation. We are removing ourselves from that potential controversy. We're putting up a barrier. We're putting a remove. You know, I sobered up in a place that my home group met in a clubhouse, and so we had, it's funny, we had a clubhouse, but we had no central office. So I had this kind of weird AA experience where everything revolved around the clubhouse, but it also made sense too that it wasn't an AA clubhouse. It was an Alano club. Right. And you could have so you, I mean, you could have AA meetings in there, you could have NA meetings in there, you could have Al-Anon meetings in there, yeah, I mean, there are all these different, and even, you know, there's Drug Dependence Anonymous meetings in there now. I mean, there's all kinds of different uses. And not only that, the clubhouse also, like my wife and I, when we needed an emergency wedding venue because our small outdoor wedding got rained out and we needed to act quickly, and, you know, for $25 we were able to book the Alano Club and we got married in the AA hall.
I love that.
Yeah.
That is so cool. So, is your wife in the program?
She is. Cool. She attends a different one of our sister fellowships, but yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, and I'm really glad you brought up, and that we just jumped right into this idea of non-affiliation and how sometimes it is so confusing, particularly to the newcomer. I know that I've had the privilege of living all over the United States in sobriety, and different geographical locations kind of handle that differently. I know here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, for instance, we've got one club over in Fort Worth that the name of the club is also the name of the group. It's and so when a newcomer walks in the door, they don't know that this is about the club or if it's about the group, particularly when it comes to dues. That particular clubhouse charges or has dues available, so you can become a member of the club, and there are some benefits and things like that that you get as being a member, but that is completely separate from the AA group that meets in there. And in that particular clubhouse, there's only one group that meets in that building. It's a standalone building, right? And so with them both being the same name, the lines can be blurred a little bit. Now, when I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, There is a clubhouse there. I'm assuming it's still there, but there was a clubhouse there called 202, and it was in reference to the address of where the street that it was on.
Mhm.
But in that, it was an old house that was a 2-story house, and they had a kitchen where they, sold all of the coffee and the literature and all that kind of stuff. But they had a main meeting room and then a bunch of smaller rooms that, like you said, multiple groups met in,
Mhm.
and it could have been AA, it could have been NA, it could have been Al-Anon, different groups. And that was, to me, a little less confusing than going to a group that meets in a clubhouse called the same thing. And it
I
sometimes
agree.
can blur the lines.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're talking about this because I sobered up in Joplin, Missouri, which uh, you know, only about 50,000 people there, and no town really of any size around it for about 60 miles, right? And we had an Alamo Club, and the clubhouse model was very much a thing, and it was no big. I mean, you had meetings all day, but they were different, distinct groups. The noon meeting was the clean air group. It was the non-smoking meeting. You had the back to basics meeting at 6 o'clock. You had the group that I sobered up in was the newcomers group that met at 8 o'clock. And you had distinct groups with distinct personalities that attended that meeting. They were able to have informed group consciences because it was this. I mean, it was they were just distinct entities, right? And so
Hmm.
yeah, I come to Kansas City, and it's like the word Alano Club is a dirty word
Right.
because all of these clubhouses that have all kinds of meetings all throughout the day, like the clubhouse that I used to attend, the group that I used to attend prior to the pandemic, they have a morning meeting, a noon meeting, a 5:30, and a 7:30 meeting, and what they really have, and it's all the same. They're all called the same thing,
Hmm.
but it's four distinct meetings with totally different people, up totally different priorities, everything about it. So when you try to have a group conscience meeting, what you end up with is you end up with a handful of people from one of those particular meetings coming up and setting the agenda and setting the rules and the tone for everybody. And maybe it doesn't apply to some of those other things, but you say, when I was the DCM, I would rant at our district meetings sometimes that we have too many meetings per group. Not
Right.
that we have too many meetings, but we have too many meetings per group. And when you have that many meetings, it's really difficult. How can you have an informed group conscience when you have hundreds of people attending the meeting every week, but you have 12 people at a business meeting, and maybe they're
Right.
all from just one particular cohort, like the morning crew are the ones that are coming to the business meeting because the business meeting is the time is more convenient for the morning crew because they're also the ones setting the agenda. I
Right.
mean, and that sort of stuff. Like I'm not saying that we have too many meetings or that we're criticizing anything, but like that's like how do you develop an informed group conscience if that's how you're going to do it? And that's always what made more sense to me with the Alano Club is they were distinct meetings that reflected, the same people showed up to those meetings.
Let's go back to this idea for a moment of non-affiliation,
Hmm.
and talk about, I was sitting in a traditions meeting at my home group last night, and we were studying tradition one. We're in the month of January, and we talked about, obviously, tradition one being about unity, and we talked about the importance of unity and how it is one of the most cherished qualities that we have in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. But at one point in the middle of the meeting, we talked about, well, it's great to talk about unity and to show examples of what unity looks like. Let's talk for a moment about disunity. And what does
Hmm.
disunity look like? Because sometimes we can't always put our finger on it. So under this idea of non-affiliation, what does affiliation, the opposite, what does the opposite of non-affiliation look like? And how is that a problem?
So that's a great question, and we have these discussions come up in our business meetings in our area assembly too. Like, because there was a lot of discussion about using like a Google grant to improve our search engine stuff. Is like, well, if we take that money, are we somehow affiliated with Google? Or are we endorsing Google? We shouldn't,
Right.
And it's like, we're not endorsing the phone book by having we weren't endorsing the phone book by having our AA information listed in the phone book, right? We were utilizing it as a tool. That is the tool, the mechanism by which we promulgate our information. You know, us taking out an ad in the newspaper or putting a PSA on the local radio, I mean, to me, that's not affiliating. That's just using the channel for its purpose. We've got this information that we need to get out to people. You know, I mean, us, being on the internet doesn't apply an endorsement of the internet. It's just the tool.
Right.
So I think that like that's, and I'm not sure how to word that in a way that makes it make sense. But I mean, it's really kind of like, it's like what the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart used to say about obscenity. I know it when I see it. I know
Right.
affiliation when I see it. Right?
Yeah, no, yeah, you're absolutely right. And it becomes our responsibility to make sure that others see it if they can't, right? I mean, because the phrase that you hear a lot is cooperation, but not affiliation.
Right.
The best example of that is I was in a conversation not long ago with someone about one of our trusted servants in our area asked me, well, is intergroup part of AA? And oh my God, depending on who you ask that question, you're going to get a plethora of different answers, right? But I
Yes,
remember
sir.
listening once to our current Southwest Regional trustee when he was asked that question, and I'm like, my ears perked up because I wanted to hear what he had to say. And he said, absolutely, intergroups and central offices are part of AA. They're just not part of the general service structure, right? And we cooperate with them in massive ways, but we don't affiliate with them.
Yeah.
Right. Because they are not part of the structure. Right. So I thought that was a really, really great analogy. And taking it back to the clubhouse, what are the challenges? And we'll get off this affiliation in a moment and kind of talk about some of the other things in Tradition 6. But what are some of the other challenges or obstacles that a newcomer might encounter when they see the lines being blurred between affiliation and cooperation?
You know, I think one of the potentially confusing things is with like and again, in Joplin, where I sobered up, there's a very large sober living community. There's one major program in particular that I won't state their name because I'm trying to avoid any affiliation or endorsement, right? Implied or whatever. But it's a 200 bed facility. They do a lot of work with veterans and with stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they would invite, they would bring van loads of their residents to our meetings, in particular at 8 o'clock, the newcomers group. And I think that, and sometimes they would invite people into the facility to do 12-step meetings and stuff like that and different things like that. I think that there was some confusion about like is this facility that we're in, is this AA? And it's like, no, it's not AA because the house that you're living in requires you to pay dues. It requires you to attend a certain number of meetings. There are a lot of other rules and stuff like that go on with it, and none of that is AA. For instance, again, like to even use a local example in Kansas City, and I was having this conversation with another friend about registered meetings. Like there's a registered meeting in my district that meets at a sober living house. I mean, they've got a group number, but they don't have a GSR. They don't pass the 7th tradition BASC. They don't really do any of the stuff that we sort of, would recognize as a traditional AA meeting. I hesitate to use the word appropriate AA meeting, but you know what I'm saying. I mean,
Sure.
And it's compulsory attendance for all the residents have to attend this house meeting. But it primarily exists to get people like me and you in the AA community to go in there and to do the needed 12-step work of sharing our experience, strength, and hope, being there to help sponsor people or to get them connected to the broader AA community.
Sure.
So
Sure.
it's a registered meeting in the sense that it's got a group number from the General Service Office, but it's not a, to me it's not an AA meeting.
And that,
You know what I mean?
and I think that right there is the kind of the key to all of this, which is it may be an AA, it may be an environment that feels like AA. It may have AA things on the walls. It may have AA
Yes.
literature in racks.
Yep.
But
Grapevine
yet,
subscription, you name it. Yeah.
right, but they are not held to the same set of suggested guidelines through our traditions and
Right.
our concepts that an AA group is. And
They will
so
absolutely kick you out of a sober house
that is correct.
for not following the rules. They will absolutely tell you to pack your stuff.
And we have a responsibility. Bill and and all of those that have gone before us worked very hard, knowing alcoholics can be obstinate and rebellious and because we're selfish and self-centered by nature and want to do things our ways. They worked very hard in building our traditions and our concepts to ensure that our life-saving message will be available to our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren in the same way, carrying the same message of depth and weight that it carried when you and I walked in the door, right? And non-affiliation helps ensures that that will continue. I mean, the best example, and you've done enough study in AA history, the best example is the Washingtonians, right? The Washingtonians aligned themselves with all kinds of outside influences, and over a period of time, they ended up folding, and it went away. So
Yeah.
I think there's great value to this. I want to switch gears for a second, and I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all of the guests that come on the podcast to talk about a tradition. My guess is when you walked in to Alcoholics Anonymous and you saw the shades on the wall for the 12 steps, you thought, okay, and maybe you may have already known what they were or had some inkling or notion about them. But my guess is that when you first walked in, that you didn't also do like, okay, there's the steps, there's the traditions, there's the concepts, let's get this done.
Yeah.
We come in because our first legacy of recovery, or our first legacy, which is around recovery and the 12 steps, helps us identify our alcoholism, and what AA can do for us, right? And how we can become recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. But the traditions, not so much. I didn't care about the traditions when I first came in. At what point in your recovery were the traditions brought into your life, and how were they opened up to you?
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, you nailed it in the beginning of when I first came into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and I looked on the wall, the only step that I was really interested in working was step 9, because I needed a new way to say I'm sorry, right? I've worn out every other possible way to apologize to my family, to my loved ones, to the people that were around me. And I thought, okay, surely this will be a grand enough gesture that I can get a new apology and kind of buy my way back into the life that I've once again flushed down the toilet by choosing alcohol instead of literally anything else. But I consider myself very fortunate. The group that I sobered up in, the Newcomers group at that time, had a lot of really strong service people in it, and it was a literature oriented meeting. Not every meeting was not necessarily a book study, but we had we had a big book study on Thursday nights that was read a paragraph or two and then have discussion, and sometimes we might only read one paragraph and go around the room and have meaningful discussion about that one paragraph. And then on Monday nights we had a 12 and 12 study, and my first sponsor was a big proponent of the 12 and 12. He was like, get this book, we're gonna read it together, we're gonna go through it, you're gonna be at the Monday night 12 and 12 study. So and that meeting too is the same thing. We go a paragraph or two at a time, and we do a step and a tradition. And there were so many good service people in there, people that were really that attended district meetings, that attended area assemblies, that knew about what there was a good legacy of general service. And that group had a couple of past delegates who were, they had passed, they died by the time that I had gotten to the group, but their memory was strong, and that group knew its history, and there was a legacy of service. I mean, the group was founded by a guy that they used to call Big Book Bob, and Big Book Bob would go to he would take he'd go to the treatment center and pick up 2 different carloads of people and bring them to the newcomers group. And it was started, and of course it was started above a bar on Joplin's Main Street above Wilder's. Now, when I got there, they were meeting at the Alno Club on the south side of town. I mean, that's you would hope that a meeting started by a guy named Big Book Bob would be really grounded in the literature, right?
Right.
And it was. And I was surprised as I got older in sobriety and went to different meetings, that most meetings, it seems like, don't ever study the traditions at all. So I just happened to luck into this meeting where I'm sitting right by my sponsor and his sponsor, and there was a couple of people up around there that really knew what they were doing, and we'd talk about these traditions, and they would give these examples, and they knew the history. And I just thought that's how everybody grew up in AA, and it's not.
It definitely is not.
where they started to become like meaningful and actionable in my recovery and in my life was a little bit further along in my service journey. You know, I mean, like the first place that I really start to have to practice them was when I started going to business meetings in my home group regularly.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of principles, a lot of personalities that can get in the way of principles. And we had a lot of conversations in that meeting about, like, what are we going to do about all of these transient sober house people that are getting bussed into our meetings, that don't identify themselves properly. They don't put a dollar in the basket. I mean, it's like every 90 days we're having a knockdown drag out over what are we could make, and that was about the turnover, right? Like, just as soon as we'd start to get some of these people like used to how we would do things and what proper etiquette at an AA meeting, well, then they'd kind of wash out or whatever, and here'd come a whole new crop, and it would start all over again, right?
Right.
But
right.
That's that was when they first started to become meaningful to me. But I think as I've gotten older, there's been real value in the traditions, not just in the AA places of service, like business meetings and group consciences and things like that, but I use them in work and my marriage all the time.
And I'm so glad you said that. And I'm going to put a pin in that, because I want to come back to that, because I think that that's a huge piece that we don't talk near enough about when we're having traditions conversations, is how to apply them personally. But I want to say this before I forget, in the interest of complete transparency and total honesty, I think we should let our listeners know that you and I are both currently actively involved in the general service structure, doing service at the area level. You're in area 39, correct?
Correct.
No, yeah, 39, area 39,
39.
Western Missouri.
Correct.
And you are the panel 71 area chair, correct?
Yep.
And I am in area 65 Northeast Texas, the panel 71 alternate delegate. And for those of you who are not familiar with what panels are, in this case, panel 71 covers 2001 and 2002. So a panel is generally a 2-year time frame. But I want to go back and I want to talk about this idea of applying the principles found in the spiritual principles found in the traditions in our personal lives, within our personal relationships, possibly even at work. And because I think that the foundation of these traditions can be taken outside of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and put into practical application. I know that when I have had the opportunity to be taught first what they are, and then how they apply to the group itself and to the fellowship itself. And then I'm asked the question, all right, so how can I apply this in my personal life? You know, some of them are a little bit easier than others, like tradition one, the spiritual principle of unity, right? I mean, I can look at how that applies at the group inside the fellowship, how it applies in my marriage, how it applies in my relationships with my family, how it applies in that our common welfare should come first, personal success, and I'm going to put it in a work perspective, personal success in my job depends upon company unity, right? I mean, there are all kinds of ways that I can apply unity across all parts of my life. Non-affiliation is not necessarily as easy to apply across all areas of my life, but I want to read a snippet from the book Language of the Heart on Tradition 6, because I think it may begin to open up some avenues for conversation for us.
Sure, go ahead.
It says this tradition declares in substance that the accumulation of money, property, and the unwanted personal authority so often generated by material wealth comprise a cluster of serious hazards against which an AA group must ever be on guard. Tradition 6 also enjoins the group never to go into business, nor ever to lend the AA name or any money credit to any outside enterprise, no matter how good. Strongly expressed is the opinion that even clubs should not bear the AA name, which we've talked about, that they ought to be separately incorporated and managed by those individual AAs who need or want clubs enough to financially support them. But it closes up with this, and I thought this was beautiful. We would thus divide the spiritual from the material, confine the AA movement to its sole aim, and ensure, however wealthy as individuals we may become, that AA itself shall always remain poor. We dare not risk the distractions of corporate wealth. Years of experience have proven these principles beyond doubt. They have become certainties, absolute verities for us. So this idea of money, property, and prestige, in so much of our literature, it talks about how that has been the downfall for the alcoholic, right? And how we need to be aware of that as we're working in our groups and working in the fellowship. But how do I need to be alert, awake, and aware to those things outside of the fellowship? How can they cause me trouble, I guess, is a great way to ask the question.
Well, and it is a great question. I think we could probably spend another hour talking about it. For me, I think though, this idea of non-affiliation, non-endorsement. Have you ever heard the expression, watch the parade, don't march in it?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Yeah. Like when I see somebody like getting like, and usually it's used in the context of somebody's being crazy. I can get in the parade of crazy, or I could just step back. I mean, for me, it's I think of it as staying in my own hula hoop, right? Like, is this something that I need to get affiliated? Is this a work situation that I need to affiliate with, that I need to tie into and get right in the middle of it and start to fix things, start to do it my way. It's kind of like it's me, and I struggle with boundaries. Like I had no concept of what healthy, appropriate boundaries are, man. Like I just, and
welcome to the club.
Right. And I'm still not great at boundaries, but like this space says, hey, you know what? I don't have to link arms or link up with everything that comes into my path. I can be discerning, I can be thoughtful, and I can be like, you know what, maybe this isn't the right thing for me to get involved with. Maybe I don't need to hitch my wagon to this mule. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And one example that I have heard, and I think that it may even be a similar example in the 12 and 12, but it may be in some other literature as well. But for example, if I were asked by my governor to sit on the governor's Council on Alcoholism.
Right.
And the only reason I was asked to be on the Governor's Council for Alcoholism was because I was a member of AA. I need to be
Right.
willing to say no to that.
So
Now,
this,
if
yeah.
if the governor asked me to sit on their council on alcoholism because I personally, individually have been sober for over 34 years, and I have a breadth of experience in what it's like to get and stay sober and give away a message of recovery. As an individual, I can absolutely do that as long as I don't ever connect the two. And I loved that example.
Yeah, that made me think of a story that my grand sponsor tells. I hope he doesn't get mad at this. I'm going to speak very generally to make sure that I don't.
Just don't say his name.
Well, yeah. So he was involved at a national level with a professional organization that dealt with substance use and disorder, mental health issues. Right. I mean, he's professionally, clinically, everything like that, credentialed, professional, etc. They wanted to have like a parade to kick off Recovery Month or whatever, and they wanted him to lead the parade. Just as you said, not because of his professional background and everything that he'd done and all the all of his credentials, but they wanted him to lead the parade specifically because of his his decades of sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. They wanted him to identify himself and claim AA in that way, and he told him he couldn't do it. Right. And for exactly the reason you're talking about. It would have been a different story if they would have been like, we want this person to lead the parade because of their decades of service in a professional clinical capacity in this field, and just not mentioned anything at all about AA. He would have been Grand Marshal of that parade, dude. Sure. He would have been,
I hear
but
you.
because they didn't want to, there was no express or implied affiliation of AA with that, and also he didn't want to break his anonymity at the public level. So
sure,
that's
anonymity is the easiest out there for sure. But we have to also speak into existence the fact that it would be a violation of Tradition 6 on some level, because we were supporting the connection of Alcoholics Anonymous to, in your case, the parade, or in my example, the state government, right? And we can't do that. I want to go back to something you said a minute ago. And I loved your honesty. You said, I have had, and from time to time still have, problems setting boundaries. One of the biggest tools, or one of the most important tools that I have found in my time in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous that has been beneficial to me, is this idea of inventory. How has inventory been important in your life, specifically around the spiritual principles that are attached to our traditions, all of them for that matter? Because the reason I bring this up is because I heard, and you've probably heard it before, that old saying of the steps help the individual recover, the traditions help the groups recover, the concepts help world service recover. Or another way of saying that is, the steps keep me from committing suicide, the traditions keep me from committing homicide, and the concepts keep me from committing genocide, right? Yeah. And I love that. But what's inherent and implicit in a statement like that, even though those are all kind of jokingly offered and certainly nowhere in our literature, what's inherent there is my willingness to take inventory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the inventory process is a fact-finding and a fact-facing deal, right? If I'm not taking a regular look at what I'm doing and at how I'm doing it, Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just really important to pause and take stock because I can get lost in the weeds in the day-to-day grind of just being me and
Right.
just oppressed by the whole weight of the world, right? So sometimes I've got to stop and I've got to take stock. I mean, I'm a big believer in keeping a journal, which I use as sort of like not always a daily inventory, but oftentimes it's a daily inventory. And I can look back on, especially man, when I look back on where I was in like year one, year two, and the problems that I had, and like kind of where my focus was and where my spirituality was at the time, different things. And I mean, like that's a way for me to measure and track my growth. It's sort of just like I don't agree with people who say things like, well, I mean, I understand the sentiment when somebody says, well, the length of time that I've been sober doesn't really matter. All that matters is today. Yeah, but no. Like, I mean, like it's important for me to remember that, I've been doing this for a while now, and I have that experience of having lived through this at different times in my life, and at different points in the journey. Maybe I've been climbing the mountain, or I've been down in the valley, and it's important for me to sometimes stop and to look back and review that journey and to see how far we've come. And if we don't take into account where we were when we were started, and we don't kind of keep track of our progress, we can lose that sense of perspective and get kind of lost in the day-to-day just stuff of it, man. So I think for me the inventory process is really important to look at me and take stock on things. And one of the things particularly that the tradition has helped is I had to inventory my gossip at work.
Hmm.
And you want to talk about like me having like one of the things that has helped me so much deal with gossip at work, at the workplace, is our tradition of having no opinion on outside issues.
Right.
So when people would bring workplace gossip to me, well, I don't really have an opinion on that today.
Right. Right. And we were talking about that in our tradition study last night as well, that kind of gossip and character assassination is just brutal to entity, group, office, unity, right? It's
Yeah.
just, it's brutal. But kind of going back to, and I'm going to stay here for a moment, but going back to from the reading, in the 12 and 12, where Bill was very clear about the fact that this tradition really helps us separate the spiritual from the material, right? And inventory is a really, really great way to do that. And one of the best ways to do that is for me to identify, what do I get to surrender, right?
Yeah.
I believe that in every step, and in most, if not all, of our traditions, and likely our concepts as well, I am called to surrender something. In step 6, in tradition 6, what do we get to surrender? What do we get to let go of?
Money, property, and prestige.
That's right.
Like chasing them, seeking them, being beholden to them. If we don't have those things, that doesn't become something that we can fight over.
And having that get in the way of
Yeah.
the maintenance of our spiritual condition,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Who gets the credit? Who gets to count the dollars? Who gets the cash and prizes?
Right, 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 right,
I'm
right.
really glad you brought that up too, because I think one of the things and the reason that I picked this topic in particular, if you don't mind
Sure,
me
go for
segueing
it.
into that,
Absolutely.
the reason I picked this topic in particular is because of the experience that I had at my first home group, where we let problems of money, property, and prestige really drive a wedge into what had been a very strong, very vital group. We had a treasurer who ran off with uh, $3,600 worth of funds, like they emptied the kitty, and had been passing off for 6 months. He'd been passing these bogus financial reports at our business meetings, and we'd just
Mhm.
taken his word because we didn't have any security measures in place, or kind of like two-factor authentication or anything like that. We just, I mean, and it's not like we had a great deal of money. I mean, like our group was pretty committed to not having a bunch of, like, money. We were either spending money on rents, books, or sending it on down the triangle, right?
Mhm.
But him not paying any of the bills for 6 months, he'd accumulated about $3,600, and and he, went off and did that. And people got really upset. Like, I remember the discussion at the business meeting. Like, there were some people that were really upset that, like, like the group's reputation was at stake, because we had, like, we're like, why, by this group, we pay our bills, we send so much money down to the general service office, and we send so much money to the area, and that's part of our, we do that. And people were really hung up on that idea. Like there was some prestige in how big the basket is. And my personal feeling on it is, if the basket makes rent, makes enough to have literature available and stuff like that, and to send a GSR to the assemblies, and and if we're passing some on down to the general store, that's fine. I mean, like, like, that's, we should not be worried about how much we're sending to down the ladder as a sign of prestige. But it's like, hey, we want to be the biggest and baddest group, right? And people were upset that we hadn't been making those contributions for like 6 months. And like, I mean, just like we had these two big business meetings about it, right? The first one was to announce that all this was done, and we had a couple of, like, because people were like, we haven't paid rent to the club in 6 months. Well, the club wasn't going to kick us out.
Right.
Like, there was no danger whatsoever that the meeting was going to be shut. Like, we weren't going to be able to meet. Like, the Alano Club was going to lock the newcomers group out because we hadn't paid for 6 months. In fact, the only reason we even knew about it is because somebody, the club manager, said, "Hey, we haven't got your rent check in a little while. Is everything okay? Or you guys, do you need, like, is everything okay?" So. And at that meeting, we had a couple of longtime members who had big bank accounts. They're like, "Look, we'll write a check, whatever the group needs." Well, and we could have passed the hat in that first meeting and gotten, most of the money back right there. Probably all of it. Although some people, I'm sure, would have complained about taking a large check from some of the well-heeled members, and that's a seventh tradition issue that's probably worth having a discussion on as well.
Sure.
But it's like, so that was the first meeting. And in the second meeting, we brought our treasurer in to hold him to some account. And he, bless his heart, it's hard for me to talk about it because he was my first sponsor, and I wouldn't be here today if he hadn't saved my life. And he was, when I was first coming in, and I asked him to be my sponsor, he was as good an example of Alcoholics Anonymous as you could ever hope to see. And somewhere along the way, he got sick again, and
Right.
he didn't drink, and he didn't drink immediately, but he got spiritually sick, and that's part of what precipitated him needing the money. So,
And Greg, that
yeah.
right there is as beautiful of an example as there is to the plight of the alcoholic, and how money, property, and prestige can get in the way of our recovery, can get in the way of our unity as a fellowship. Because I've heard it said once, and I love it, that anytime I am violating any tradition 2 through 12, I'm automatically violating tradition 1. I am messing with the unity. Unity is a common thread through every single one of our traditions. And yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful story, because it just elevates the idea that sometimes we alcoholics can lose sight of spiritual principles and put things like money, property, and prestige on the front burner.
Let me tell you how that second meeting went real quick, because this is the thing that I think where the money and the prestige did exactly what you talked about, Rick. We violated tradition 1, and it caused disunity in the group, and broke the group apart. He showed up at the meeting. He was defiant about what he had done, and was not, He wasn't in a position spiritually to make it, to offer an amends and to make one. And it's almost like some people in the room didn't like his tone. You know what I mean? Like they felt like he probably should have stretched. And so there was a big discussion about what to do. And initially, so because some people wanted to press charges and really really hold him to account. Like they felt like, we've got to send a message. You wouldn't let somebody walk into your business and steal $3,600 and not press charges, right? Even though, well, wait a minute, this is Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And it's the damnedest. It is the darndest thing, because I've actually seen because the minority opinion was offered. At first, we decided that we were just going to let it ride. You know what I mean? Like he admitted to it, and you and I know, and we know that there's no punishment that we can inflict on an alcoholic worse than the punishment that we would inflict on ourselves.
That is right.
And he has suffered since then completely. I mean, he's no longer sober. He doesn't have any program, and his life is not in a great place. But so the minority opinion was offered, and one particular elder statesman in our group actually managed to convince more than a 2/3 majority that we needed to set an example with this.
Right.
That we needed to hold him accountable. That we needed to teach him a lesson. So we taught him a lesson, and we took him to court. And the GSR of my home group was my new sponsor at that time. He had to go and file a police report and do all that stuff. And he was not personally in favor of doing it, but the group conscience had spoken, and so he did it. And what happened is even though we had a business meeting and there was substantial unanimity, eventually people picked sides, and people felt that it was inappropriate for us to do that.
Right.
And the group split.
Right.
And it's been dying ever since. It's taken a really long time to die, because there was a lot of good, strong service legacy, but it's just about gone.
And that right there is the perfect example of why we have to be aware of the importance of a tradition like Tradition 6, and how it can, if abused, can cause disunity inside the fellowship. But it wasn't, in this case, it wasn't just the fellowship, it was also inside this man's life, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of conversations like this that we can constantly be reminded of the importance of our tradition. So Greg, thank you so much for taking, we're about out of time. I wanted to give you an opportunity to offer one closing comment on Tradition 6. Is there anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put these spiritual principles into practical application in their lives? Just one thing you want to leave them with.
I mean, money, property, prestige is a lot bigger than just the no endorsement or affiliation with an outside issue. I mean, that's the big thing to me. I mean, like that part of it is pretty cut and dried and pretty clear. But yeah, I mean, there's so many ways that these things can really, as you said, Rick, they can really just bring about disunity and tear us apart.
And we have a responsibility to ensure that doesn't happen, right?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Greg, thank you for your time and for your service. I'm confident that our listeners will be able to take a lot away from your sharing. So thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, Tradition, and Concept Studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.